The great hall of the Galactic Conclave stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, and the ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. Admiral Kira Vasquez had never felt so small in her entire life as she did standing among the human delegation on that terrible day. All around her stood the representatives of 19 starfaring civilizations, beings who had sailed between the stars when humanity was still learning to make fire. The ancient Vorath with their skin like living stone and their eyes that glowed with the light of dying suns. The calculating Scythian whose bodies were made of pure crystalline energy and whose minds could process more information in a second than all of Earth's computers combined. The insectoid who had built empires across 3 galaxies. And so many others whose names humanity had only learned in the past 50 years. High Arbiter Thelios floated at the center of the hall, his crystalline form shifting through colors that had no names in any human language. He had led the conclave for over 2,000 years, and his word was law among the stars. When he spoke, entire civilizations listened. "We have reached our conclusion," Thelios announced, his voice echoing through the hall like thunder rolling across mountains. "The Devourer fleet cannot be stopped." A murmur ran through the assembled delegates, though most of them had expected this verdict. The Devourer fleet was a nightmare that had haunted the galaxy for 10,000 years, a swarm of self-replicating machines left behind by a civilization that had died long before any current species had evolved. The machines had one purpose: to consume all resources and convert them into more machines. They moved slowly across the galaxy, but they never stopped, and nothing had ever survived their approach. "The theoretical weapon known as the Cascade Disruptor remains our only hope," Thelios continued. "But after 3 cycles of deliberation, our finest minds have confirmed what we have always suspected. The weapon is impossible to build." Admiral Vasquez felt her hands tighten into fists at her sides. She had read the reports, had studied the schematics that the Vorath had recovered from ancient ruins. The Cascade Disruptor could work in theory, could send a wave of energy through the Devourer fleet that would overload their systems and shut them down forever. But theory and reality were very different things. The Scythian ambassador stepped forward, its crystalline body pulsing with complex equations that scrolled across its surface like living tattoos. "Allow me to explain for the benefit of our younger members," it said, and Vasquez knew that the comment was directed at the humans. "The Cascade Disruptor requires the simultaneous harmonization of over 12 million quantum frequencies. The mathematics alone would take our most advanced computation clusters 40 years to solve. Furthermore," the ambassador continued, "the weapon requires a firing array larger than most space stations, materials that exist only in theoretical models, an energy output that exceeds the total output of a medium-sized star. Even if we began construction today with unlimited resources, the weapon could not be completed for at least 3 centuries. And the Devourer fleet will reach the outer human colonies in 16 hours, Thelios added, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "We have already begun evacuation procedures, but we estimate that no more than 40% of the population can be saved." 3 billion souls, Vasquez thought. 3 billion human beings who would die because the galaxy's greatest minds had looked at a problem and decided it was too hard. "The humans are young to the void," Thelios said, and his crystalline form flickered with something that looked almost like pity. "They do not yet understand what impossible means to those who have sailed the stars for millennia. We have seen countless species rise and fall, have witnessed technologies that would seem like magic to younger races. When we say something cannot be done, it is not because we lack imagination or courage. It is because we have learned the limits of what the universe allows." Vasquez wanted to scream at him, wanted to tell him that humanity had not survived ice ages and plagues and world wars by accepting limits. But she held her tongue because she knew that anger would accomplish nothing here. The meeting continued for another hour as the various delegations discussed evacuation routes and resource allocation. The Vorath offered to take in human refugees on their outer worlds. The Cathari pledged ships to help with the evacuation. Everyone was very kind and very sorry, and none of them believed for a single moment that humanity could be saved. As the delegates began to file out of the Great Hall, Vasquez felt a presence beside her. She turned to find an ancient Vorath elder standing there, his stone-like skin cracked with age and his eyes burning with a light that seemed older than the stars themselves. "You are the one they call the Iron Admiral," the elder said, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "Some call me that," Vasquez replied. The elder was silent for a long moment, studying her with those ancient eyes. "I have lived for 4,000 years, he finally said. "I have seen empires rise and fall, have watched stars being born and dying. I was there when my people first discovered the schematics for the Cascade Disruptor in the ruins of the Builders." "And you believe it is impossible," Vasquez said. "I believe," the elder said slowly, "that it would require someone willing to ignore everything we know about how the universe works, someone foolish enough to try building something that cannot be built, someone stubborn enough to keep working even when every calculation says they will fail." He leaned closer and his voice dropped to a whisper. "I believe it could work, Admiral. I have always believed it. But my people are too old, too careful, too afraid of failure. We have lived so long that we have forgotten how to take risks." "Why are you telling me this?" Vasquez asked. The elder smiled, and it was a strange and terrible thing to see on that ancient stone face. "Because I have studied your species, Admiral. I have read your history, have learned about your wars and your disasters and your countless failures. And I have noticed something that sets you apart from every other species in this galaxy." "What is that?" "You never know when to quit," the elder said. "You fail and you fail and you fail again, and somehow you always get back up. You do not accept limits. You do not understand the word impossible. And that, Admiral, might be exactly what the galaxy needs right now." He pressed something into her hand, a small crystal that glowed with inner light. "The complete schematics," he said. "Every calculation, every material requirement, everything you would need to build the weapon. I give them to you not because I believe you will succeed, but because I believe you deserve the chance to try." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of delegates like a shadow fading into darkness. Vasquez looked down at the crystal in her hand. 16 hours, she thought. 16 hours to build something that the greatest minds in the galaxy said could not be built. She smiled. It was time to get to work. The message reached Earth at exactly 1847 hours Greenwich Mean Time, transmitted through quantum relay stations that stretched across half the galaxy. It contained the complete schematics for the Cascade Disruptor, along with a simple message from Admiral Vasquez. "We have 16 hours to save 3 billion lives. I am asking for help." Within 15 minutes, the message had been forwarded to every major university on the planet. Within 30 minutes, it had reached every military installation and aerospace contractor. Within an hour, through channels both official and completely unofficial, it had found its way to basement workshops and garage laboratories and online forums where people built impossible things just because they wanted to see if they could. Dr. Alina Okonkwo was eating a late dinner at her desk at MIT when her computer lit up with the incoming transmission. She was 53 years old, had spent her entire career studying theoretical physics, and had published more papers on quantum mechanics than almost anyone alive. She read through the Scythian calculations 3 times, and then she did something that her graduate students had never seen her do before. She laughed. "They optimized for precision," she said to herself, shaking her head in disbelief. "They spent 40 years trying to find the perfect solution when a good enough solution would work just fine." She grabbed her phone and started making calls. In Geneva, a retired weapons engineer named Hans Berger was watching the evening news when his phone rang. He was 71 years old, had worked on defense projects for 3 different governments, and had been forced into retirement 5 years ago because his superiors said his ideas were too dangerous to pursue. "Hans," said the voice on the other end of the line, "it's Elena. I need you to dig up those old files from Project Thunderclap." Hans smiled. Project Thunderclap had been shut down because the mathematics did not quite work out, because the energy requirements were too high, because there were too many things that could go wrong. But Hans had always believed that with a few modifications and a lot of luck, the weapon could actually function. "I'll have them to you in 10 minutes, he said. In Shenzhen, a factory owner named Liu Wei was reviewing production schedules when she received a call from her cousin in the Chinese Space Agency. Liu Wei did not build weapons. She built components for satellites and space stations, precision instruments that had to work perfectly in the harshest conditions imaginable. But she also knew more about advanced materials than almost anyone on Earth. "They want us to build what?" she asked, staring at the material requirements that had just appeared on her screen. "Something impossible," her cousin replied. Liu Wei studied the list carefully. 17 different alloys that did not exist, materials that had only been created in laboratory conditions in tiny amounts. It would take years to manufacture enough of them for a full-scale weapon. But then she noticed something. The materials did not need to be perfect. They only needed to hold together long enough to fire once. "I can do it," she said. "It will be ugly and dangerous, and it will probably fall apart after a single use, but I can do it." "How long?" 6 hours if we start right now." By 2100 hours Greenwich Mean Time, a decentralized network of 40,000 people had formed across the planet. They communicated through secure channels and shared files through encrypted servers, working together even though most of them had never met, and many of them did not even speak the same language. In Boston, a team of graduate students rewrote the targeting algorithms that the Scythian had spent centuries developing. They did it in 4 hours by throwing out everything elegant and replacing it with brute force calculations that required a human operator to make constant adjustments. It was messy and inelegant and would have made any Scythian programmer weep with horror, but it worked. In Tokyo, a group of retired aerospace engineers came out of retirement to design a mounting system for the weapon array. They used parts from decommissioned satellites and cargo ships, held together with emergency welds and industrial adhesive. When one of them pointed out that the design would never pass safety inspections, another simply laughed and said, "What safety inspections?" In a basement in Melbourne, a 17-year-old hacker named Sophie Chen broke into 3 different military satellite networks to give the weapon system access to the targeting data it would need. When military security tried to lock her out, she sent them a message that simply said, "I'm trying to save the world here. Please get out of my way." 20 minutes later, she had full access and a job offer from the Australian Defence Department. The sun set over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, and humanity kept working. Admiral Vasquez monitored the progress from her ship in orbit, watching as reports flooded in from across the planet. She had asked for help, and help had come from every corner of the Earth. Scientists and engineers, factory workers and hackers, students and retirees, all working together on something that every expert in the galaxy said could not be done. "Admiral," said her communications officer, "we're receiving a transmission from the Galactic Conclave. High Arbiter Thelios is demanding to know what we're doing." "Tell him we're building a weapon," Vasquez replied. "He says that's impossible." Vasquez smiled. "Tell him we're doing it anyway." As midnight approached and the hours counted down toward disaster, something remarkable was happening on the planet below. People who had been strangers 12 hours ago were now working side by side, sharing ideas and solving problems, and refusing to give up even when every obstacle seemed insurmountable. A factory worker in Germany had an idea that solved a power distribution problem that had stumped the engineers. a high school physics teacher in Brazil, figured out a way to reduce the energy requirements by 30%. A grandmother in Canada who had worked on the Apollo program 60 years ago remembered an old trick that made the frequency harmonization system actually function. They did not sleep. They did not rest. They did not stop to wonder if what they were doing was possible. They simply worked, hour after hour, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion because they knew that failure meant the deaths of 3 billion people. And slowly, impossibly, the weapon began to take shape. In orbit above the Earth, construction drones swarmed around the half-built skeleton of a new space station. Their original purpose had been forgotten. They were now building something that had never existed before, something that defied everything the galaxy's greatest minds believed about physics and engineering. The Cascade Disruptor was coming together. It was ugly and dangerous, and held together by emergency repairs and desperate hope. But it was real. And in 9 hours, it would either save humanity or prove that the Scythian had been right all along. The Voreth observer was named Kethros, and he had been alive for 2,000 years. He had seen wonders that would have driven lesser beings mad with awe. He had walked on worlds where the mountains were made of diamond and the rivers flowed with liquid light. He had witnessed the birth of stars and the death of civilizations. But he had never seen anything like what was happening aboard the human vessel ISS Endeavour on that impossible night. "They are welding hull plating while the metal is still cooling," he reported to his superiors back on the Conclave observation station. "They are not waiting for proper safety protocols. They are not running simulations. They are simply building." "That is extremely dangerous," came the reply. "I am aware," Kethros said, watching as a human technician climbed across the outer hull without a safety tether, moving with a speed and recklessness that made his ancient heart race with fear. And yet they continue. Commander Marcus Jackson was the officer in charge of the orbital construction team, a grizzled veteran of 30 years in the Space Corps who had seen more than his share of impossible situations. He had slept for exactly 45 minutes in the past day, and he was running on caffeine and determination, and the absolute refusal to let 3 billion people die. "Commander," one of his engineers shouted across the construction bay, "we have a problem with the power coupling on Section 7. The Scythian designs require a superconducting interface, but we don't have the materials." Jackson did not hesitate. "Then use a regular interface and boost the power to compensate. That could cause a cascading overload." "Only if we're unlucky," Jackson replied. "Get it done." In the targeting control room, a 22-year-old graduate student named Maya Patel was rewriting core algorithms while eating cold pizza with one hand. She had been awake for 31 hours, her eyes were red with exhaustion, and she had consumed enough energy drinks to give a normal person a heart attack. She was also doing some of the most brilliant work of her young life. "The Scythian approach won't work," she muttered to herself, her fingers flying across her tablet. "They want to calculate every frequency in advance and fire them in perfect sequence. That would take years, but what if we calculate them in real time instead?" It was a crazy idea. Real-time calculation would require a human operator to make constant adjustments during the firing sequence, compensating for variations and fluctuations that a computer could not predict. One mistake could cause the entire weapon to fail. It would be like trying to fly a spacecraft by looking out the window and guessing. But it was also the only option they had. "I can do it," Maya said to no one in particular. "I can make this work." Kethros watched her with his ancient eyes, and something stirred in his heart that he had not felt in centuries. It took him a moment to recognize the emotion. Hope. Down on Earth, the factories had not stopped running since the message arrived. In Shenzhen, Liu Wei had turned her entire facility into a production line for impossible materials, pushing her workers and machines beyond their limits. They had already had 3 equipment failures and 2 minor injuries, but no one complained, and no one asked to stop. "The alloy mixture is unstable," one of her engineers reported. "It will hold together for maybe 10 minutes under full power." "We only need 6 minutes," Liu Wei replied. "Keep working." In laboratories across the planet, scientists were making discoveries that would normally take years. They did not have time for careful research and peer review. They simply tried things and saw what worked. If an idea failed, they threw it out and tried something else. If an idea succeeded, they shared it immediately with everyone else. A physicist in Germany discovered a way to stabilize the frequency harmonization, using principles that the Scythian had dismissed as too primitive to be useful. He published his findings in an open forum and saw them implemented in the weapon design within 20 minutes. A materials scientist in Japan figured out how to strengthen the hull plating using a technique that she had invented just 3 hours earlier. She had not slept in 2 days, but she was smiling as she sent her data to the construction crews in orbit. An electrician in Nigeria solved a power distribution problem that had been causing failures throughout the system. He was 64 years old, had never worked on anything more complex than building wiring, but he saw the problem in a way that the experts had missed. "You're running too much power through too few channels," he wrote in a message that reached Commander Jackson an hour later. "Split the load and it will work." Jackson tried it, it worked. As the night wore on and dawn approached, the weapon took shape in orbit above the Earth. It was not beautiful. It was a mess of welded plates and improvised components and systems that had been designed on the fly. Warning lights flashed constantly, and alarms sounded every few minutes as one system or another threatened to fail. But it was holding together. And it was almost complete. "Admiral," Kethros said in a private communication to Vasquez, "I must confess something. I did not believe you could do this. I have watched your species for 50 years, and I thought I understood you, but I see now that I understood nothing." "What do you mean?" Vasquez asked. "You do not test," Kethros said, his voice filled with wonder. "You do not simulate, you do not wait for certainty. You simply build and trust that you will solve problems as they arise. It is madness. It is beautiful madness." Vasquez smiled. "We call it making it up as we go along." "And does it usually work?" "Often enough," Vasquez said. "And when it doesn't work, we pick up the pieces and try again. That's what being human means. We fall down and we get back up, and we keep trying until we succeed or until there's nothing left to try." The sun began to rise over the Pacific Ocean, sending golden light streaming across the planet. In factories and laboratories, in workshops and control rooms, 40,000 exhausted humans looked at what they had built and felt something that words could not describe. The Cascade Disruptor was complete. It was ugly. It was unstable. 3 of its 12 primary emitters were already showing warning signs. The power systems were running at dangerous levels, and the targeting algorithms required constant human adjustment to function. But it existed. And in 2 hours, they would find out if it could save the world. The Devourer fleet emerged from the darkness of space like a tide of death, billions upon billions of machines moving in perfect coordination, their metal bodies gleaming in the light of distant stars. They had destroyed 17 civilizations in their long journey across the galaxy, had consumed worlds and moons, and turned everything they touched into more machines. Nothing had ever stopped them. Nothing had ever even slowed them down. Admiral Kira Vasquez stood at the command station of the weapon platform, her hands steady on the controls despite the exhaustion that weighed down every muscle in her body. Around her, a crew of 30 men and women worked at their stations, monitoring systems that were never designed to work together, watching for failures that could come at any moment. "Power levels at 92%, reported Lieutenant Chen from the engineering station. "We're in the red zone on 3 of the primary emitters." "Keep them running," Vasquez ordered. "If they overload, then we'll deal with it when it happens. Right now, We need every bit of power we can get. Maya Patel sat at the targeting console, her fingers hovering over the controls that would guide the weapon's fire. She had been awake for nearly 40 hours, but her mind was sharp and clear, focused on the single most important task of her life. She would be the one to make the constant adjustments during firing, compensating for fluctuations in real time, keeping the cascade wave stable through sheer force of will and calculation. "Targeting solution locked," she reported, "but I'm getting drift in the frequency harmonization. I'll need to compensate manually throughout the firing sequence." "Can you do it?" Vasquez asked. Maya did not hesitate. "Yes." On the observation station far behind the weapon platform, High Arbiter Thelios watched the human vessel move into position. His crystalline form flickered with colors that reflected his disbelief and confusion. He had ordered the observation to be recorded for historical purposes, expecting to document humanity's brave but futile last stand. "Arbiter," the Scythian analyst said, "the human device appears to be activating." "That is impossible," Thelios replied. "Their power matrix cannot sustain the necessary output. Their frequency harmonization is decades away from completion. The mathematics do not support." "Arbiter," the analyst interrupted, and there was something in his voice that Thelios had never heard before. "The device is charging." On the weapon platform, alarms began to sound as the power systems reached critical levels. One of the backup generators exploded in a shower of sparks, and emergency crews rushed to contain the damage. A hull plate that had been welded just hours ago began to buckle under the stress. "Hull integrity failing in Section 9, Commander Jackson reported from his position near the structural controls. "We're losing containment." "Seal it off and redirect power to the remaining sections," Vasquez ordered. "We only need to hold together long enough to fire." The Devourer fleet was now visible on the main screen, a swarm of machines so vast that it blocked out the stars behind it. They were 3 minutes away from weapons range, 3 minutes away from beginning their assault on the human colonies. 3 billion lives hung in the balance. "Cascade generator at full power," Lieutenant Chen reported, his voice tight with tension. "We're ready to fire, Admiral." Vasquez looked at her crew, these exhausted, determined, incredible people who had worked through the night to build something that the galaxy said could not exist. She looked at the screen showing the approaching fleet, at the countless machines that would destroy everything humanity had built among the stars. She took a breath. Fire. The Cascade disruptor activated. What happened next would be debated by physicists for centuries. The weapon fired a beam of energy that contained over 12 million quantum frequencies, all harmonizing in a pattern that should have been impossible to achieve. The beam was unstable, fluctuating wildly as Maya Patel made constant adjustments to keep it focused. It was imprecise, inelegant, a brute force solution that violated every principle of efficient design. And it worked. The Cascade wave tore through the Devourer fleet like a hurricane through paper. Machines that had functioned perfectly for 10,000 years suddenly stopped, their systems overloaded by a frequency pattern that their creators had never anticipated. Self-replicating code collapsed in on itself. Hivemind coordination shattered into chaos. Units that had moved in perfect synchronization began to drift, their cores dark and silent. On the observation station, High Arbiter Thelios watched in stunned silence as the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced simply stopped. "That is not possible," the Scythian analyst whispered. "The frequency harmonization was imperfect. The power output was inconsistent. The beam cohesion fluctuated by nearly 12% throughout the firing sequence. By every calculation, the weapon should have failed." And yet, Thelios said slowly, it did not. On the weapon platform, the crew erupted in cheers as they watched the Devourer fleet fall silent. Men and women who had not slept in 2 days embraced each other, tears streaming down their faces. They had done it. They had actually done it. but their celebration was cut short by a warning alarm. "Admiral," Lieutenant Chen shouted, "we've got cascade feedback in the main generator. The system is overloading." "How long?" Vasquez demanded. "Maybe 10 seconds. Vasquez did not hesitate. "All hands abandon ship. Get to the escape pods now." The crew moved with desperate speed, decades of training taking over as they rushed toward the escape pods. Vasquez stayed at her station, monitoring the feedback, trying to buy them a few more precious seconds. "Admiral, you need to go," Commander Jackson shouted from the door. "I'm right behind you," she replied, but she was still working, still trying to stabilize the system, still fighting to give her people time to escape. Maya grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the escape pods. "There's nothing more you can do. We have to go now." They ran. The escape pods launched just as the weapon platform began to tear itself apart. Vasquez was thrown against the wall of the pod as it accelerated away from the exploding structure, and then everything went dark. The weapon platform exploded in a brilliant flash of light, its components finally surrendering to the physical laws they had been violating all night. But the Devourer fleet remained silent, drifting lifelessly through space, its machines dark and dead. On the observation station, High Arbiter Thelios stood in silence for a long moment before speaking. "Begin rescue operations for the human survivors," he ordered, "and prepare a report for the full conclave." "What shall the report say?" the Scythian analyst asked. Thelios considered the question carefully. "It shall say that we were wrong," he finally answered. "It shall say that humanity has done what we believed could not be done, and it shall say that the galaxy will never be the same." He looked out at the debris field where the weapon platform had been, at the small escape pods drifting among the wreckage, at the silent remains of the Devourer fleet. "We told them it was impossible," he said quietly, "and they built it in a single night." The rescue ships found Admiral Vasquez drifting in her escape pod near the debris field, unconscious from oxygen deprivation, but alive. Her hand was still clutching a datapad that showed the final system readings, the data she had been analyzing until the very moment the pod's life support had begun to fail. The doctors said she had been awake for over 50 hours before finally collapsing. She woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed on the Conclave medical station, surrounded by flowers and messages from people she had never met. When she opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Commander Jackson sitting beside her bed, his arm in a sling but his face split by a wide smile. "We did it," he said simply. "The fleet?" Vasquez asked, her voice rough from the breathing tube they had removed just hours before. "Gone. Every single machine, shut down and drifting. The Scythian are analyzing the remains, trying to figure out how we managed to do what their calculations said was impossible." Vasquez smiled. "Let me know what they find. I'm curious myself." On Earth, the celebration lasted for days. In cities and towns across the planet, people gathered in the streets to celebrate the victory, to honor the 40,000 men and women who had worked through the night to save 3 billion lives. There were parades and speeches and monuments erected, but most of the people who had actually done the work were too tired to attend any of it. Dr. Elena Okonkwo slept for 16 hours straight and then went back to her laboratory at MIT, where she began writing a paper about the new approach to quantum frequency harmonization. It would revolutionize the field and earn her a Nobel Prize, but at the time, she was just trying to understand what they had actually done. Hans Berger returned to his retirement home in Geneva, where he found a message from the European Space Agency asking if he would be interested in coming out of retirement to lead a new advanced weapons research division. He accepted the position the same day. Liu Wei was already back at work in her factory in Shenzhen, filling orders for components that would be used in the next generation of human spacecraft. She had received 17 job offers from governments and corporations around the world, but she had no intention of leaving. Her factory had helped save humanity, and she was proud to keep running it. Maya Patel became something of a celebrity, the young graduate student who had guided the weapons targeting system through sheer skill and determination. She gave a few interviews and then retreated to her research, uncomfortable with the attention. All she had done, she said, was her job. The Galactic Conclave convened 3 weeks after the battle to discuss what had happened and what it meant for the future. Representatives from all 19 starfaring civilizations gathered in the Great Hall, and for the first time in history, they looked at the human delegation with something other than condescending patience. High Arbiter Thelios spoke first. "We have analyzed the weapon used to destroy the Devourer fleet. Our scientists have examined every component, every calculation, every aspect of its design, and we have reached a conclusion that I must share with this assembly." The hall fell silent. "The weapon should not have worked," Thelios continued. "By every measure we possess, it should have failed at no fewer than 7 critical points during construction and firing. The mathematics were imprecise. The materials were inadequate. The power systems were unstable. The targeting algorithms required constant manual adjustment that should have been beyond the capability of any operator." He paused, his crystalline form flickering with complex colors. "And yet it worked. Humanity built an impossible weapon in a single night and used it to save billions of lives. They did this not because they did not understand the obstacles, but because they refused to be stopped by them." The Scythian ambassador stepped forward. "We have a question for the human delegation. Our calculations showed a catastrophic failure probability exceeding 90%. Did your own calculations reach a similar conclusion?" The human ambassador, a gray-haired diplomat named James Chen, nodded. "Yes, we knew the odds were against us." "And you proceeded anyway." "We only needed the 10%, Chen replied simply. A murmur ran through the assembled delegates. For species who had lived for millennia, who calculated risks with precision and avoided actions that were likely to fail, the human approach was almost incomprehensible. The ancient Voreth elder who had given Vasquez the schematics rose to speak. "I have lived for 4,000 years, he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "I have seen wonders and horrors beyond counting. I have watched species rise to greatness and fall to ruin, and I have learned many lessons in my long life." He turned to look directly at the human delegation. "But I had forgotten one lesson, one that humanity has reminded me of. Sometimes the most important thing is not to calculate the odds of success, but to have the courage to try even when the odds seem impossible. Sometimes faith and determination can accomplish what logic and caution cannot." In the weeks that followed, humanity's status within the Galactic Conclave shifted dramatically. They were no longer the young species, the naive newcomers who did not understand how the universe worked. They had become something else, something that the ancient races had forgotten could exist. They had become unpredictable. And that unpredictability, the Conclave realized, was both humanity's greatest strength and its most unsettling quality. You could not calculate what humans would do, could not predict how they would respond to a crisis, could not assume that they would behave according to logic and reason. They did not accept limits. They did not surrender to impossible odds. They simply kept pushing until something gave way. 1 month after the battle, the Voreth elder requested a private audience with Admiral Vasquez. She was still recovering from her injuries, but she agreed to meet with him in a small garden on the Conclave station, surrounded by plants from a dozen different worlds. "I have a question," the elder said, "that has been troubling me since the night of the battle." "Ask," Vasquez replied. "Your people knew the odds. They knew the weapon might fail, might explode, might kill them all and accomplish nothing. Building it required 40,000 individuals to work through the night on something that every expert in the galaxy said was impossible. How did you convince them to do it?" Vasquez was silent for a moment, considering the question. "We didn't convince them," she finally said. "We just asked." We told them what was at stake and what needed to be done, and they chose to help. That's all. But the odds... The odds didn't matter, Vasquez said. What mattered was that there were 3 billion people who would die if we didn't try. What mattered was that there was a chance, however small, that we could save them. When you put it that way, the choice was easy. The elder was silent for a long moment, his ancient eyes studying her face. I have met many remarkable beings in my 4,000 years, he said at last. Warriors and scholars, leaders and artists, heroes and villains, but I have never met a species quite like yours. Is that good or bad? Vasquez asked with a small smile. I do not know, the elder admitted, but I suspect that the galaxy is about to find out. He rose to leave but paused at the door. One more thing, Admiral. You asked me once why I gave you the schematics, why I believed you might succeed where we had failed. I told you it was because your species never knows when to quit, but that was not the whole truth. What was the whole truth? The elder smiled, and it was a strange and wonderful thing to see on that ancient stone face. I gave you the schematics because I wanted to believe that the impossible was still possible. I wanted to believe that courage and determination could still overcome the cold mathematics of probability. I wanted to believe in miracles. He looked at her with eyes that had seen millennia pass, and you proved that I was right to believe. Admiral Vasquez watched him go, and then she turned to look out at the stars, the countless points of light that stretched across the darkness, each one a sun with worlds of its own, each one a place where life might exist and civilizations might rise. Humanity had earned its place among those stars. And the galaxy would never forget the night they built the impossible.